Just over 2 weeks to go until the Ohio primary election, and it's going down to the wire in the race for the Republican nomination for U.S. Senate. Ahead on Face the State, 3 candidates want the GOP nod. State Senator Matt Dolan, Ohio Secretary of State Frank LaRose, and businessman Bernie Moreno. Today, an extensive interview with Secretary LaRose, focusing on domestic and foreign policy, from security at the southern border and abortion to the conflicts between Russia and Ukraine and Israel and Hamas. Republican Senate candidate Frank LaRose on the issues, now on Face the State. Thanks for joining us this Sunday morning for Face the State. I'm Doug Petcash. Just about 50,000 Ohioans have already voted in the March presidential primary, either by absentee ballot or in person at Board of Elections offices. Also, according to the Secretary of State's office, more than 115,000 have requested an absentee ballot. That's as of Thursday morning. Keep in mind, there are roughly 8 million registered voters in Ohio. Besides president, the top race on every party ballot across the state is the race for one of Ohio's U.S. Senate seats. On Democratic ballots, Senator Sherrod Brown is running for his 4th term representing Ohio. He is unopposed in the Democratic primary. On Republican ballots, 3 candidates are vying to be the one to challenge Brown in the November general election. The very high-profile race pits State Senator Matt Dolan, Secretary of State Frank LaRose, and businessman Bernie Moreno against each other for the Republican nomination. I wanted to delve deeper into their stances on some of the key issues in the state, the country, and the world. So I invited all of them to discuss their positions and ideas here on Face the State. Last week, State Senator Dolan joined me. You can watch that interview on 10tv.com. I've also reached out to the Moreno campaign and am waiting to hear back. Today, my guest is Secretary of State Frank LaRose. He is serving his 2nd term as Secretary of State. Before serving as Secretary, LaRose served 2 terms in the state Senate. He is also a U.S. Army Green Beret and is currently serving in the Army Reserves. Secretary LaRose, thank you very much. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you, Doug.
Let's get right to it. Let's talk about some domestic policy issues. We see it a lot in the news. We see it a lot in the political ads, and we're talking about border security at the southern border. As a U.S. Senator, what would you do to secure the southern border?
Yeah, first of all, this is where I speak from experience. Every candidate goes down there and they pose for a photo op or a field trip at the border. For me, this is something that I lived as a soldier. I served on the U.S.-Mexican border as part of a counter-narcotics task force. That was 24 years ago. What we saw was a disaster then. It's a full-scale invasion now. I've laid out a very clear plan for what really should be done immediately. The president could do this if he had the courage to do it, I would argue. And it's 3 military divisions on the border. That's not an extreme idea. Again, I was in uniform on the border 24 years ago, under the Clinton administration, actually.
And what would their role be?
Well, their role would be to secure the border, right? We're called the Department of Defense for a reason. And stopping a foreign invasion from occurring, which is really effectively what's happening down there when you look at the massive humanity that's coming across the border. 3 military divisions can secure a 2,000-mile land border. They don't need to be down there long. It's an 8-month or a 12-month deployment until the wall is built. And we also need to make it clear that you won't benefit from coming here. That means if you've come to our country illegally, you'll be deported. If you're already here illegally, you should be deported. And there's no access to government benefits of any kind, or you face a lifelong ban on citizenship if you come to this country. I've also been clear that we need to declare the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. They are bringing fentanyl into this country that's killing 200 people a day. And this is where I've differed from my opponents. They've said, well, it's irresponsible to say we'd use the military. Listen, if Mexico's not willing or able to work with us, then we absolutely must be willing to use both lethal force and financial sanctions to go after the cartels.
Doesn't that create some pretty big diplomatic issues, though, if you're having to go across the border to take on the cartels?
It can potentially, but listen, the role of the federal government is to protect the lives of Americans. 200 people a day is like a fully loaded passenger plane crashing every day. If that was happening, we would ground all the aircraft until we figured out what was happening. Here, we don't need to figure it out. We know what's happening. It's precursor chemicals from China And Biden has refused to hold Xi accountable for that. In fact, he just took his word for it in California when they met a couple months ago. Those chemicals are coming to Mexico, being concocted by the cartels and smuggled across the border. When I was on the border, we would search people coming across the border carrying precious children. And we would find that they had put bags of cocaine into their diapers, thinking we wouldn't look there, right? What a terrible thing for someone to do. Today, it's not cocaine, it's fentanyl, and it's deadly in tiny doses. Sheriff Jones, the Butler County Sheriff, who's endorsed me, had a traffic stop just a couple months ago. They found enough fentanyl on I-75 in the trunk of a car to kill 1.5 million people. We must use force to stop that from happening.
Do you support any level of amnesty?
No, absolutely not. In fact, what happens when you encourage amnesty is it encourages bad behavior, particularly right now with the asylum process. The reason asylum exists is because you're in jeopardy in your home country. But if you have passed through 3 or 4 relatively safe countries, then are you really seeking asylum, or are you just trying to abuse the system to get into our country?
We'll go to another huge issue, of course. Much discussion about abortion across the country and here in Ohio. You are pro-life. I believe you've said that you would support a federal limit on access to abortion. What would that limit be in your plan?
Well, what I've been clear about is that there should be federal standards. And this is something that doesn't get negotiated here in this context. It gets negotiated among 100 senators, among representatives, and brought to the floor. This is something that I think that the states are working on in many cases in different directions. You've seen what happened in Ohio and in other states, but we should have a minimum standard. We as a country are not a people that should be the most liberal in the world. I mean, right now, what is allowed to happen is late-term abortion. That's something that even most pro-choice Americans think goes too far. And so, yeah, we should have a conversation about this. It should be thoughtful, but I'm not going to say these exceptions or this many number of weeks. I'm for doing what we can do to protect life in this country, and that's something that'll be worked out on the floor of the U.S. Senate.
So you don't support the 6 weeks being the limit for abortion?
Again, what I'm for is what we can do to protect life. As a practical matter, I don't think that has any chance of passage. And so let's talk about what's practical, and let's find a solution that we can agree on that affirms life and move forward on this issue in the best way that we can, and stop letting the extremes kind of dictate the terms.
You would be representing, obviously, the people of Ohio. They voted rather resoundingly in November, 57% to 43%, to legalize abortion here in the state. When you're thinking about representing the people of Ohio and this issue, how much is that in your mind about what the people want?
Well, even the context of your question, you said they voted to legalize. Abortion was never fully made illegal in Ohio. It was just a certain number of weeks or exceptions or whatever else. I was asked on a radio interview just days after the November issue passed. The host said, well, it's evident by this that a majority of Ohioans support some access to abortion. And I said, yeah, you're right. It is evident that a majority of Ohioans support some access to abortion, but what was passed in Ohio is not some access to abortion. What it really is the most extreme pro-abortion law in the country. I don't think that's consistent with Ohio's values. I think we should have a continuing conversation about this, about making sure that we have something that Ohioans can agree on.
The Alabama Supreme Court recently ruled that frozen embryos are human beings. Where do you stand on that issue and how it relates to couples having access to in vitro fertilization access?
Well, first, let me start with a very clear statement. I am pro-life and I am pro-IVF, and these things are not contradictory ideas to one another. In fact, it's concerning that in some cases there has been a bit of fear-mongering about this, saying, well, people are trying to ban IVF. I know of no one who's trying to ban IVF, certainly not my fellow Republicans. I can't speak for the other 2 candidates, but I've heard them express support for the treatment as well. We need to affirm families. We need to make it such that people that need fertility treatment, that need IVF, know that that is available to them, and no one's trying to take that away from them. We need to be a society that helps people to form families, because a strong country starts with strong families. We all come from one, and so we need to be able to help people to do that. But like any medical treatment, IVF can be done ethically or unethically. I think that it's a smart thing that the state of Alabama is now working to address what really is probably an unintended consequence of their law, to make sure that in Alabama and in other places, people know that they will continue to have access to IVF. Of course, it needs to be done in an ethical way, though.
The economy is always a big issue, of course. What do you see as the biggest threat to the economy?
I think that the biggest threat to our economy is government overreach in many cases, right? The secret sauce to American prosperity, from my read of history, has always been hardworking people, great natural resources, and the freedom to make the first two work together to create prosperity. One of the things that we're lacking right now is the freedom to truly engage in that free market economy that has been the engine of human prosperity in this country since our founding. That means that we need to cut taxes. We need to streamline regulations. Doug, some of the worst things that happen in the federal government don't happen on the House floor or the Senate floor, but on the 20th floor of some federal office building where a bureaucrat, unaccountable bureaucrat, is dreaming up rules and regulations for people to follow. We need to rein that in and really take a machete to the bureaucratic state that considers itself almost a fourth branch of government. We need to do oil and gas drilling. We need to be energy dominant as a nation. Those are the things that we need to focus on.
We see it right here in Central Ohio, of course. High cost of living, high mortgage interest rates,
Yes.
high cost of housing, inflation.
Yeah.
What can you do about it?
Well, this is a question I got from a reporter a couple of weeks ago. Why do you say the economy's bad? Look at these economic statistics. According to the BLS,
Well, unemployment's 3.7%. Yeah.
Well, but here's the thing. This reporter said, the economy's doing pretty good. My question is, for who? Maybe if you live off a stock portfolio or if you live off of a trust fund, but for those of us that earn a living, that earn an hourly wage, a salary, everything costs more, but wages have not been going up to keep up with that. The solution to this is getting government out of the way and actually doing free market policies. Now, again, the Biden administration thinks that you can spend trillions of dollars on green energy subsidies, but call it the Inflation Reduction Act, and it's going to reduce inflation. It's government spending that throws gas on the fire. And meanwhile, Biden's playing firefighter and arsonist at the same time. He's causing inflation, but then the Federal Reserve Bank is continuing to raise interest rates, which are also creating this vicious cycle that cause it to be hard to buy a home now.
We're seeing fantastic growth in the area, of course, with Intel, Google, Facebook. What can you as a senator do to ensure that the growth can continue, but the towns and cities can handle it?
Yeah. Well, I served as the transportation chairman in the state Senate, and I think that one aspect of that is to focus on transportation policy, and I mean investing in roads and bridges and the infrastructure that we actually need to grow our economy. But the growth that we're seeing here in Ohio is also a testament to the fact that when you cut taxes and streamline regulations and, yes, engage in smart economic development to attract businesses to come here, that it can really make a difference. We also need to focus on making sure that people know that Ohio's a great place to live, work, and raise a family. Low cost of living, high quality of life. We need to continue to invest in that quality of life, including our schools and our local communities. These small towns in Ohio have so much unrealized potential. It's just a great opportunity to take some of these small towns and turn them into a true live, work, and play community.
And the challenge is going to be keeping the cost of living manageable.
Absolutely. And that's always a challenge, right? I mean, and part of that means that we need to, at the state level, continue to look at all the different levels of taxation. Right now, property taxes are really hurting people. It's because of inflation and that automatic adjustment that happens with inflation. But the state legislature needs to take a look at this to make sure that the growth in property taxes is kept under control, especially for those on a fixed income. There are a lot of seniors right now really struggling with the massive increases in property taxes.
I know that you're a Second Amendment supporter.
Yeah.
We had another high-profile mass shooting at the Kansas City Chiefs Super Bowl celebration. But we're also seeing gun violence in the Columbus area and throughout the state. What can you do to cut down on gun violence with our kids and other people dying in the state?
We have a societal problem. We have people that attempt to do conflict resolution via firearm. We have people that don't take seriously what it means to discharge a firearm. As somebody that's carried a gun for a living since I was 18 years old, I know full well how dangerous these implements can be, but I also know that disarming law-abiding people is not the answer. This is where there's a real contrast between me and the other two people running. They both have spent a lot of money trying to convince people that they're conservatives. Ohioans aren't buying it because they see their past record. I have consistently stood to protect the Second Amendment. I have a 100% pro-gun voting record, and I've been endorsed by Buckeye Firearms, where you see my opponent Mr. Moreno, in particular, recorded a video just 3 years ago where he was mocking gun owners, where he was talking about confiscating firearms from people. That's not a conservative position. The Second Amendment exists not just for the enjoyment of shooting sports or for hunting, but because armed people are free and a disarmed people are not.
But how do you stop the violence?
Yeah, mental health treatment, youth mentorship. We need to get really focused on who are the people that are engaging in this kind of violence, and it's not about the implement necessarily. It's about the motive and what causes people to feel so desperate in their lives, so disconnected from society that they want to engage in this kind of thing. That's the deeper problem that needs to be solved here.
We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll get Secretary LaRose's stances on some of the big foreign policy issues of the day, including the danger Russia poses to us and what America's role should be in Ukraine and Israel as conflicts continue to rage on. Welcome back to Face the State. I'm Doug Petcash. Today we're focusing on the race for the Republican nomination for U.S. Senate in Ohio. We've heard Secretary of State Frank LaRose's positions on several of the big domestic policy issues. Now we turn to his stances on some of the key foreign policy issues. Mr. Secretary, first of all, let's talk about Russia.
Yeah.
We heard of the death, mysterious death of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny a couple weeks ago. The war in Ukraine is still going on. How dangerous is Russia in terms of our foreign policy?
No, Russia's dangerous, and it's not mysterious how Navalny died. Navalny died at the hands of Vladimir Putin, and we need to be clear that Putin is a bad actor, and that he is someone who is causing instability around the world, no question about it.
So, when you look at the war in Ukraine going on, huge debate right now about funding for Ukraine and support for Ukraine. What needs to be done there so that Russia doesn't win, and what should America's role be?
It's interesting, of the three of us, there's a real spectrum on this. It seems like with Mr. Dolan, it's just continue throwing money at it, which is kind of the Biden approach that hasn't been working. With Moreno, it's, hey, wave the white flag, not our problem, let it burn, which is deeply irresponsible as well. What I've been clear about is, of course, we need to be focused on our own domestic security, including the border. That needs to be the laser focus right now. But there are also things the world's most exceptional nation can do to make sure that this comes to a prompt end. For example, the sanctions are not working the way that they're supposed to. There are Russian oligarchs that have bared no burden at all for the for the actions of their country. Making those sanctions work the way they're supposed to is important. There's also something that's near and dear to me. As an Army Green Beret, what we do is train foreign militaries. That's what we're specialized in. Right now, the only people training the Ukrainians are the British. We've got battalions of Green Berets at Fort Campbell and Fort Bragg. Why not have them in Poland or Romania or Hungary, very safe places where they can actually be training these Ukrainians, better equipping them to go into the fight? That doesn't cost much, but it would have a good strategic impact.
Should we continue to financially and militarily support Ukraine?
I think that the problem is there's not the accountability that there needs to be. And this is where it's shocking to me that Republicans in the House and the Senate have called for there to be an inspector general, for example. The Biden administration has resisted that. That's shocking to me. I think that there are some real problems that need to be exposed with the way that funding is working before we go forward with it. But we need to bring this conflict to a conclusion, and there needs to be a strategy to it. I don't see that with the Biden administration. It's that old thing of, if you're holding a hammer, everything looks like a nail. To the Biden administration, everything can be solved by just dumping money on it, and it's not working in this case.
What role do you think the U.S. should continue to play in the conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza?
America is the undisputed leader in the world militarily, economically, and diplomatically. We have to accept that role. This sort of isolationist idea that we can pretend the rest of the world is going to go away is a foolish one. In fact, when we ignore the rest of the world, things get bloodier and costlier. It is American weakness that causes instability, not American strength, is another way to say that. This is where it was shocking to me that days after October 7th, and let's think about what happened on October 7th, more Jews were murdered that day than any day since the Holocaust, when Hamas, with Iran's backing, poured across the border into these kibbutzim, these little villages and they murdered hundreds and hundreds of people brutally, including a place I visited just a year ago, a kibbutz called Kfar Aza, where 50 innocent children were brutally murdered. Mr. Moreno, just days after that, when we were both in a forum and he was asked, would you support more funding for Israel? He said, Israel doesn't need America's help. That's shocking to me. Of course, Israel needs America's help. For 76 years since the founding of the modern state of Israel, they have needed our help. And they also need America to not be in their way, which I believe the Biden administration is right now. Let me be clear. Hamas started this. Israel didn't start this, but they have every right to finish it, and that means that they have to be given the leeway to rid the Gaza Strip of Hamas. Only until that happens can they really bring this to a conclusion.
So what about the suffering of the innocent people there in Gaza who are caught in the middle of all this?
Well, listen, the people of Gaza also bear some responsibility for electing Hamas. 76% in that election that they elected Hamas to be their government, and allowing that to continue. That preparations for that invasion happened right under their noses. But of course, from a humanitarian standpoint, there need to be things done, and Israel is in many cases doing those. This is why war is a terrible situation, and the only thing worse than a war is one that is drug out by half measures. They need to be able to get this done, and get this done robustly and promptly, and of course abide by the Geneva Conventions and taking care of non-combatants and everything else. I can tell you from experience, it's very difficult in a place like Gaza to tell who are the combatants and who are the non-combatants, and so the Israeli military, the IDF that I have trained with as a member of the Green Berets, we trained with the IDF. They have a very difficult task in front of them, but they must be allowed to accomplish that task.
We're going to take one more break here, and when we come back, still to come on Face the State, a final thought from Secretary LaRose on what his first year in office would look like if he wins the Senate race overall. And welcome back once again. We just have about a minute left with Secretary LaRose on his bid for the Republican nomination for U.S. Senate. If you win the primary and the general election, you would obviously be a new senator.
Yeah.
What would your approach be in that first year as a new senator? Would you sit back and learn, or jump right in?
I jump right in. We've already got enough sort of showmen. We need some more statesmen. We need people that are going to roll up their sleeves and get things done. We're going to take back the Senate majority when I beat Sherrod Brown, and so one of the first priorities is getting a good conservative leader to be our majority leader in the Senate, and that's something I'm going to focus on. One of the other things we're going to focus on is making the Trump tax cut permanent. When a multi-billion-dollar tax cut expires, it's a tax increase. We need to make that tax cut permanent, set to expire next year. One of the things I really want to focus on, of course, is border security. I believe that President Trump will be the man in the White House at that point, and I think he's going to have a focus on that, but he's going to need good allies in the Senate. And again, as somebody who served on the border, I will be a key ally for him on that. And then finally, reining in the bureaucratic state. There's a bill called the REINS Act that I want to pass that will actually pull back the reins on the people that consider themselves a fourth branch of government that have gone way beyond what they're supposed to be doing.
Secretary LaRose, thank you so much for your time, and best wishes in the coming weeks as we get closer to the primary election.
Thank you, Doug.
Well, you can watch my interview with one of Secretary LaRose's opponents, State Senator Matt Dolan, on 10tv.com right now. This interview with Secretary LaRose will post online shortly. Also, as I mentioned, I've reached out to the Bernie Moreno campaign to request an interview, and am waiting to hear back. That's all of our time for today. Thank you so much for joining me this week for Face the State. I'm Doug Petcash. I'll see you next Sunday at 11:30.